Let's get started. Story number 1.
The old beach house stood alone on the edge of the dunes, its weathered frame battered by years of salt and wind. It had been cheap, almost too cheap, for a rental during spring break, but for 5 college friends looking for a quiet getaway, the deal had been too good to pass up. Anna, David, Lisa, Mark, and Rachel arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand. The house loomed in front of them, 3 stories tall, with peeling white paint and dark windows that reflected the orange glow of the sky. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," Rachel joked, nudging Lisa. "Yeah, well, as long as it's got hot water and Wi-Fi, I don't care," Mark said, hauling his duffel bag up the steps. David unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The air smelled musty, like damp wood and something else, something older. The floors creaked beneath their feet as they explored. The furniture was outdated but solid, the kind that had been in the house for decades. A wide staircase led to the upper floors where their bedrooms waited. "I call the room with the balcony," Anna announced. "No way," David said. "You always get the best room," Anna smirked. "First come, first served." Rachel, the last to choose, ended up with the smallest room on the 3rd floor. It was tucked beneath the eaves with only a single round window that faced the ocean. The bed was pushed against one wall, and a tall, antique mirror stood in the corner. She frowned. "Okay, that thing is creepy." Lisa peeked in. "Then throw a sheet over it. Problem solved." Rachel rolled her eyes, but dragged her suitcase in anyway. It was just a mirror. That night, they gathered in the living room with drinks, playing card games, and laughing over old stories. The waves crashed rhythmically outside, a soothing backdrop to their chatter. At some point, Anna glanced at her phone. "It's past midnight." Lisa yawned. "I'm calling it. Long drive. I need sleep." They all agreed and climbed the stairs to their rooms. Rachel closed her door behind her and turned to the mirror. It felt too large for the small space, its glass surface dull and cloudy. She hesitated, then grabbed a towel from her suitcase and draped it over the top. She climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. At first, the sound of the ocean lulled her towards sleep. Then she heard it. A soft scratching. Rachel's eyes snapped open. It was coming from inside her room. She held her breath, straining to listen. The sound was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. She sat up. The towel had slipped off the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her in the dim light. But something was off. She squinted. The reflection wasn't quite right. The angle was wrong, as if the room in the mirror was slightly different from hers. Then her reflection blinked. A fraction too late. Rachel's stomach turned to ice. She forced herself to look away and rolled over, squeezing her eyes shut. It was a trick of the light, just exhaustion. She didn't sleep. The next morning, the house felt different, off-kilter, like the walls had shifted slightly overnight. Lisa was already in the kitchen making coffee. "You look like hell," she said when Rachel walked in. "Didn't sleep," Rachel muttered. Anna joined them, stretching. "Did anyone hear that weird noise last night?" Lisa frowned. "What noise?" Anna poured herself coffee. "Like knocking? I thought it was one of you guys messing around." Rachel's grip tightened around her mug. David and Mark wandered in, looking just as groggy. "I heard it too," David said. "It woke me up, but I figured it was the wind." Rachel swallowed hard. "It wasn't the wind." They all turned to her. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind." They spent the afternoon at the beach, trying to shake the eerie feeling. The sun was bright, the sand warm beneath their feet. By the time they returned to the house, it almost felt normal again. Almost. That night, the knocking returned, louder. Rachel sat up in bed, heart hammering. It was coming from the mirror. She turned slowly, dread curling in her stomach. In the dim light, her reflection stood in the glass. But it wasn't her anymore. The figure in the mirror was too tall, too thin. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its mouth stretched into a wide, grinning shape. Rachel couldn't breathe. Then the reflection took a step forward. The glass didn't stop it. Rachel screamed. The others came running, throwing open her door. "What's wrong?" David demanded. Rachel pointed at the mirror. It was in there. It moved. They stared at the mirror, just her own reflection now. Shaking, Rachel grabbed a blanket and threw it over the glass. "I don't care what you guys say. I'm sleeping downstairs." Lisa sighed. "I'm staying with you." They dragged their blankets to the couch, and soon the house fell quiet again. Then, footsteps. Slow, dragging. Rachel's blood ran cold. She turned her head slightly. At the base of the stairs, something stood in the shadows, tall, grinning, watching. Lisa stirred beside her. Rachel. Rachel grabbed her arm. Don't move. The figure twitched. Then it moved toward them. The air turned freezing. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps. The thing was almost there. Then it vanished. Lisa screamed. The others rushed down, demanding answers. We're leaving, Rachel gasped. Now. No one argued. They threw their bags together in minutes, racing to the car. As they sped away, Rachel looked back at the house. A figure stood in the third-floor window. Smiling, the next day, Rachel searched online for any history on the house. There was nothing. No records, no listing. It was like the place had never existed. But Rachel knew the truth. And that night, as she checked her bedroom mirror at home, the reflection smiled back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The road to Ocean Pines was narrow and winding, cutting through dense patches of cypress trees and salt marshes. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the distant scent of the ocean. For miles, there were no signs of life, just the occasional rusted road sign, half covered in vines. This place is in the middle of nowhere, Ryan muttered, adjusting his grip on the wheel. That's the point, Emily said from the passenger seat, her sunglasses perched on her nose. We wanted to get away from the crowds. We could have just gone to Miami, Jake chimed in from the back, stretching his legs. Olivia, who sat beside him, rolled her eyes. You hate Miami. Ryan sighed. Well, too late now. We're almost there. The rental house appeared at the end of a long dirt road, tucked between the dunes. It was bigger than expected, 3 stories, weathered gray wood, and a wraparound porch that faced the water. It's kind of isolated, Olivia said hesitantly as they pulled into the gravel driveway. That's why it was cheap, Emily pointed out, grabbing her bag. They climbed the porch steps, and Ryan pulled out the keys the owner had left for them. The lock turned with a satisfying click, and the door swung open, revealing the dim interior. The house smelled of salt, old wood, and something else, something stale. Inside, the decor was outdated but comfortable. Dark wooden floors, a massive stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. A staircase led up to the bedrooms, while the kitchen and dining area stretched toward the back of the house. Jake dropped his bag on the floor. All right, first things first, who's getting which room? They explored the upstairs, choosing bedrooms. Ryan and Emily took the master bedroom, which had a balcony overlooking the ocean. Jake and Olivia each took smaller rooms at the end of the hall. That just leaves the attic room, Emily said. They climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, finding a small bedroom with slanted ceilings and a single window facing the dunes. Jake grinned. This has horror movie written all over it. Well, I'm not sleeping here, Olivia said. Then I guess it's mine, Jake said, throwing his bag onto the bed. By the time they settled in, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The house creaked softly in the wind, but otherwise it was peaceful. That night they drank on the porch, listening to the waves crash against the shore. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and there were no other houses in sight. This is perfect, Emily sighed, leaning against Ryan. For now, Jake said with a smirk, taking a sip of his beer. Later, as they got ready for bed, Olivia hesitated outside her room. Did anyone else hear that? Ryan frowned. Hear what? She hesitated. I don't know, it sounded like knocking. They listened, but the house was silent. Old houses make noises, Emily said. Come on, let's just sleep. Everyone went to their rooms. The knocking started again around 3 in the morning. Ryan woke to the sound, slow, deliberate taps. Knock, knock, knock. He turned over trying to ignore it. Then he realized something. The knocking wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house. His eyes darted to the bedroom door. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. Knock, knock, knock. Ryan nudged Emily awake. Do you hear that? Emily blinked groggily. Hear what? Then a loud thud from the attic. They both sat up. What the hell was that? Emily whispered. The house was silent again. Ryan exhaled, rubbing his face. It's probably Jake messing with us. But in the morning, Jake looked just as exhausted as they did. Dude, he muttered, running a hand through his messy hair. I swear I heard someone walking around last night. Ryan stiffened. We heard knocking. Olivia set down her coffee. So it wasn't just me? They exchanged uneasy glances. Okay, Emily said, forcing a laugh. We're just psyching ourselves out. No one's been in this house for weeks. It's probably just the wind. But the unease lingered. That night, the knocking came back. This time, it was louder. Ryan sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The sound echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. Then a whisper. Just outside the door. His breath caught. The whisper was low, raspy, but he couldn't make out the words. Emily whimpered beside him, clutching the blanket. Then a footstep. Slow, deliberate, moving toward their door. Ryan reached for his phone, fumbling with the flashlight. The moment he turned it on, the sound stopped. Silence. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking as he crept toward the door. He held his breath and yanked it open. The hallway was empty, but the attic door was open, and at the top of the stairs, a figure stood there. Ryan's breath hitched, his flashlight flickered, then the figure moved, not walking, gliding, straight toward him. Ryan slammed the door and locked it. Ryan? Emily's voice was shaky. He swallowed, there's someone here. They didn't sleep. By morning, Ryan had made up his mind. We're leaving. No one argued. They packed in a rush, shoving clothes into bags. But as Ryan zipped his suitcase, he noticed something. The mirror across the room. Something was wrong. His reflection wasn't moving. Ryan's stomach dropped. He lifted a shaking hand. His reflection didn't. Then, slowly, it smiled. Ryan stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The others rushed in. What happened? He pointed at the mirror. But his reflection was normal now. Ryan's hands trembled. Let's get the hell out of here. They ran to the car, throwing bags into the trunk. The house loomed behind them, silent and waiting. As they pulled onto the road, Olivia glanced back. There's someone in the window, she whispered. They didn't look. They didn't stop. By the time they reached the highway, the house felt like a distant nightmare. But that night, as Ryan lay in his own bed, something woke him. A whisper right next to his ear. You shouldn't have left. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The drive to Oak Island felt endless, the road stretching ahead in a straight line, flanked by marshes and skeletal trees. The air was thick with humidity, the occasional buzz of cicadas filtering in through the car windows. Are we even sure this place exists? Brian asked, leaning forward from the back seat. Of course it exists, Megan replied, rolling her eyes. It's just not some tourist trap like Miami. You know this place is supposedly haunted, right? Luke smirked from the passenger seat. People say it used to be a fishing village until half the town disappeared. Disappeared? Liz, who was driving, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Yeah, Luke said. One day the fishermen just never came back. No wrecks, no bodies. Some people say they got caught in a storm. Others think something in the water took them. Megan scoffed. That's just a story to scare tourists. Brian crossed his arms. Either way, we got this house for dirt cheap. I'm not complaining. The house was exactly as the pictures had shown. An old beachfront property, its gray wooden planks weathered by salt and wind. It sat alone on a stretch of sand, a long pier extending out into the water. The nearest house was at least half a mile away. As soon as they stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy in a way that made Megan shiver. The floorboards groaned under their feet, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Feels like we're walking into a time capsule, Liz muttered. The living room was dimly lit by the evening sun, the large windows streaked with dust. A set of stairs led to the second floor, where the bedrooms were. There was something unsettling about the silence of the house, like it had been waiting for them. They spent the first night drinking on the back deck, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. The breeze was warm, but Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? She asked, hugging her knees to her chest. Liz turned to her, raising an eyebrow. Paranoia already? Megan sighed, forcing a smile. Maybe. That night, as she settled into bed, she heard something, a faint tapping sound. Megan sat up, heart pounding. Tap, tap, tap. She glanced at the window. The wind had picked up, branches swaying outside. It must be the wind, she told herself. She lay back down, closing her eyes. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving down the hall, her breath caught. She turned her head toward the door, barely able to make out the thin sliver of light from the hallway. The footsteps stopped right outside her room. Megan held her breath. Then, The doorknob turned. She shot up, scrambling for her phone. The door creaked open an inch. Megan? She exhaled sharply, realizing it was Liz. What the hell? Megan hissed. Liz looked pale. Did you hear that? Megan nodded. Someone was walking out there. They checked the other rooms, but everyone was asleep. The house was silent again. The next morning, Brian looked exhausted. I had the weirdest dream, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. I swear I heard someone whispering in my room. Liz and Megan exchanged glances. You too? Liz asked. Brian frowned. Wait, did something happen last night? Megan hesitated. We heard footsteps. Luke scoffed. Come on, guys, this place is old. Old houses make noises. But that night, the noises came back. Megan woke to the sound of whispering. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like a chant. She sat up, pulse hammering. The whispering was coming from inside the house. She reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The moment the light hit the room, the whispering stopped. Her skin prickled. She listened, barely breathing. Then a knock at her door. Megan jumped. A shadow moved under the doorframe. Her heart pounded. Slowly, she got up, inching toward the door. She reached out, and the knocking started again. Faster, more frantic. She yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. Megan's stomach twisted. Then, from downstairs, a loud bang. She ran to Liz's room, shaking her awake. Something's in the house, Megan whispered. Liz bolted upright. What? Another bang echoed from downstairs. They grabbed Brian and Luke, the four of them creeping down the stairs. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. Then Liz gasped. The front door was wide open. Megan's pulse skyrocketed. I locked that, Liz whispered. They stepped onto the porch, their breath shallow. The beach stretched out before them, empty under the pale glow of the moon. The waves lapped against the shore, calm and steady. But then, footprints in the sand, leading from the water, straight to their front door. Luke swore under his breath. Brian stepped closer, his phone light shining down at the prints. They were bare footprints, long and narrow, the toes slightly pointed, and they were wet. A slow, creeping terror filled Megan's chest. She followed the prints with her eyes. They stopped right at the threshold of the house, but there were no prints leading back to the ocean. Brian exhaled sharply. Screw this. We're leaving. No one argued. They packed in minutes, throwing their bags into the car. As they sped away, Megan looked back at the house. A figure stood on the porch, watching them. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest gas station miles away. No one spoke much. They just sat in the car, the radio playing softly. Finally, Liz broke the silence. Did anyone else see it? Brian nodded slowly. Yeah. Luke swallowed. It was in my room last night. Megan's stomach turned. Brian ran a hand through his hair. We're never talking about this again. Everyone agreed. But weeks later, Megan woke up in her apartment, heart pounding. Her room was cold. Too cold. She turned over, reaching for her phone, and froze. There, on the floor beside her bed, a single wet footprint. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The drive to the lake house took longer than expected, the road winding through thick forests and steep hills. The sun was beginning to set by the time the five of them, Eric, Jess, Nate, Olivia, and Ben, finally arrived. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, its wooden exterior aged and worn from years of exposure to the elements. It was larger than expected, with 2 floors, a wraparound porch, and a long dock extending into the dark, still waters of Black Hollow Lake. This is perfect, Jess said, stretching as she got out of the car. Way better than some overcrowded beach town. Nate groaned. Yeah, but we barely have cell service out here. That's the whole point, Olivia said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Disconnect for a few days, relax, enjoy nature. Ben gave a mock shudder. I don't know. Something about this place feels a little creepy. Yeah, it's called isolation, Eric said, unlocking the door. The inside of the house smelled of old wood and dust. The living room had a stone fireplace, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. A wooden staircase led to the second floor, where the bedrooms were. There were no neighbors nearby, just miles of dense forest on one side and the vast lake on the other. All right, Jess said, dropping her bags. First things first, drinks? They spent the first night on the porch, drinking and laughing. The moon was full, reflecting off the surface of the lake. The air was cool, the only sounds the occasional rustling in the trees and the distant call of an owl. At some point, Olivia stood, stretching. I'm going to bed. Already? Nate teased. She rolled her eyes. You guys stay up. I'm exhausted. One by one, the others eventually followed. But sometime during the night, Eric woke up. A noise. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again. A soft tapping. Tap, tap, tap. He sat up, heart pounding. It was coming from the window. The room was dark, but the moonlight cast a faint glow through the curtains. Slowly, he reached over and pulled them back. Nothing. Just the lake, still and silent. Eric exhaled. He was probably just imagining things. He lay back down, trying to calm his racing heart. Then the tapping started again. Louder, more urgent. Eric sat up again, his stomach twisting. This time, he didn't open the curtains. Instead, he turned on his phone's flashlight and shined it at the window. For a split second, the light reflected off something just outside. Then it was gone. The next morning, Eric didn't mention what happened. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe he'd still been half asleep. But at breakfast, Olivia looked uneasy. Did any of you come into my room last night? She asked. Everyone shook their heads. Olivia frowned. I swear I heard someone whispering. Right outside my door. Jess forced a laugh. Maybe it was just the house settling? Olivia didn't look convinced. That night, the knocking came back. Eric woke to it again. Soft, deliberate taps against the window. He held his breath. The knocking was slow, patient, like whoever or whatever was outside knew he was awake. Then, the doorknob turned. Eric's stomach dropped. Someone was inside the house. He grabbed his phone, shining the flashlight toward the door. Nothing, but the air in the room felt different. He wasn't alone. The feeling lasted for what felt like forever until eventually exhaustion won out and he drifted back to sleep. The next morning, Eric wasn't the only one who looked shaken. I heard something walking around last night, Ben said over coffee. Like, inside the house. Same, Nate added, rubbing his temples. I swear I heard footsteps outside my door. Eric exhaled slowly. I think something's wrong with this place. They spent the day out on the lake trying to shake off the unease. By the time they got back, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dock. That's when Jess noticed something. There were wet footprints leading from the lake, up the dock, up the stairs, and onto the porch. The prints were bare, the toes long and unnaturally pointed, but there were no footprints leading back into the water. Maybe someone was here earlier, Olivia suggested, but her voice was tight. Eric shook his head. We've been gone all day. Who the hell would come out here? No one had an answer. That night, they locked every door and window. Still, the sounds came, the knocking, the whispering, and then footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Eric gripped his phone, his heart hammering. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Silence. Then, the doorknob twisted. Eric shot up, fumbling for something, anything, to defend himself. The door creaked open an inch. Eric, it was Olivia. She looked pale, terrified. Do you hear it too? She whispered. Before he could answer, a loud thump came from downstairs. They froze. Ben's voice rang out from his room. What the hell was that? Eric and Olivia ran out into the hallway just as Jess and Nate came out of their rooms, eyes wide. Another thump echoed from below. Then the front door swung open. They stood there, paralyzed. Cold air rushed into the house. The lake was pitch black outside, the dock barely visible. And then, just for a moment, they saw something standing at the end of the dock. Tall, thin, its face completely blank. Then it moved, not walking, straight toward the house. Run! Eric shouted. They bolted. Eric grabbed the car keys, his hands shaking. They didn't pack. They didn't look back. They just drove. By the time they reached the nearest town, the sun was rising. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. Did we all see it? Jess swallowed hard. Yeah. Ben exhaled shakily. It was in my room last night. Eric turned to look at him. Ben's hands were trembling. I woke up, he whispered, and it was just standing there at the foot of my bed. No one returned to the lake house. And for weeks after, Eric would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, breath shallow, convinced he could hear it, standing outside his window, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The road stretched endlessly through the Texas countryside, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty highway. Emma, Jake, Lauren, and Chris were packed into Chris's old SUV, their spring break road trip finally bringing them to the small town of Rockford. They had found a rental cabin online, tucked away in the woods, just a few miles from an abandoned amusement park that had once been a popular tourist attraction. "This place is creepy as hell," Jake muttered as they pulled into the driveway. The cabin was old, with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The trees around it were thick, their bare branches clawing at the sky. "Come on, it's perfect," Lauren said, grabbing her backpack. "We wanted an adventure, right?" Chris cut the engine, and they all climbed out. The air was cooler here, and the woods surrounding them were eerily silent. Inside, the cabin was exactly what they had expected: old furniture, dusty shelves, and the faint smell of wood rot. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fireplace in the living room. They settled in quickly, unpacking their things and setting up the cooler in the kitchen. By nightfall, they were sitting on the porch, drinking beers and laughing. The sound of crickets was the only noise for miles. "I still can't believe we're near that old amusement park," Lauren said. "You guys know the story, right?" Jake leaned back in his chair. "You mean the one where a bunch of kids went missing?" Chris scoffed. "That's just an urban legend." "No, it actually happened," Lauren insisted. "Back in the 80s, kids started disappearing from the park. It was only open for a few years before they shut it down. No bodies were ever found." Emma shivered. "Okay, officially creeped out," Chris laughed. "We should check it out tomorrow." "Absolutely not," Emma said. But by morning, she had been overruled. They followed an old dirt road through the woods, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Eventually, they reached the rusted gates of the abandoned park. Beyond the gates, the remnants of old rides stood like skeletons: tilted roller coaster tracks, a half-collapsed carousel, and a massive Ferris wheel that loomed against the gray sky. The air here was stale, and the silence was deafening. Jake climbed over the gate first. "Come on, we didn't drive all this way just to chicken out." One by one they followed, stepping onto the cracked pavement. The place was frozen in time, with faded signs still advertising tickets and snacks. They wandered through the ruins, taking photos and joking about ghosts. But the deeper they went, the heavier the air became. At the heart of the park was a small building, what used to be the fun house. The entrance was still intact, the painted clown above it peeling and cracked. "I dare you to go in," Chris challenged. Jake grinned. "You're on." Emma hesitated. "Guys, maybe we shouldn't." But they were already inside. The air was thick with dust, and their footsteps echoed against the walls. The mirrors inside were cracked, warped, some completely shattered. Then something moved, a whisper. Low, indistinct. Emma froze. "Did you hear that?" No one answered. Then the sound of running footsteps. Fast, coming from deep within the funhouse. They all turned toward the darkness ahead. Something was coming. Jake grabbed Emma's arm. "Run!" They bolted out of the funhouse, gasping for air. Chris slammed the door behind them, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" No one spoke. They ran back to the car, peeling away from the park. That night, back at the cabin, the unease lingered. The woods outside felt darker, the silence heavier. And then the knocking started. Soft, rhythmic. Coming from the front porch, Chris grabbed a flashlight, stepping toward the door. He swung it open, nothing, just the dark woods stretching out before them. Then Emma gasped. Footprints, wet footprints leading up to the porch. But there were no footprints leading away. The knocking came again, but this time it was on the back door. Chris spun around, shining his flashlight. For a brief second, the beam caught something in the window. A figure. Tall, motionless, watching them. Then it vanished. They didn't sleep that night. By morning, they packed and left. No one spoke on the drive home. But weeks later, Emma woke in the middle of the night. Her room was cold. And in the darkness, just outside her window, a faint knocking. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The spring break trip was supposed to be perfect. Warm weather, secluded beaches, and no responsibilities for a full week. Natalie, her boyfriend Josh, her best friend Megan, and Megan's boyfriend Ryan had been planning it for months. Instead of the usual tourist-packed resorts, they found a rental house on the outskirts of a small coastal town in South Carolina. It was old but charming, sitting right on the edge of a dense marsh with a long wooden dock stretching out toward the water. The moment they arrived, Megan wrinkled her nose. "It's kind of creepy." "It's rustic," Natalie corrected, stepping out of the car. "And it was cheap." Josh laughed. "She means creepy." The house was a two-story colonial with weathered wood siding and faded blue shutters. It smelled of salt and old wood when they stepped inside. The furniture was outdated but comfortable. A dusty bookshelf in the living room held old fishing guides and local folklore books. Ryan, always the curious one, grabbed a book titled Legends of the Low Country and flipped it open. "Hey, listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "They say this area is haunted by the spirits of sailors who drowned in the marsh. Supposedly, if you hear knocking on your window at night, it means they're looking for a way inside." Megan shivered. "Well, that's lovely. Thanks for that." They spent the rest of the day settling in, drinking on the dock, and enjoying the quiet. The town itself was small and nearly deserted, with a single grocery store, a diner, and a few fishing boats docked near the marina. It was peaceful. But by the second night, the strange things started. Natalie woke up just past midnight, the room eerily silent. It took her a moment to realize what had woken her. A soft tapping. At first, she thought it was a tree branch against the window, but as she listened, she realized it was too rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. She sat up, heart hammering. Josh was asleep beside her. Knock, knock. She turned toward the window, expecting to see the wind moving the branches, but there was nothing there, just the dark marsh stretching out beyond the backyard. She held her breath. Then, the doorknob to their room rattled. She gasped, shaking Josh awake. "Did you hear that?" He groaned. "What?" Another knock, this time at their bedroom door. Natalie's stomach twisted. "Josh, someone's in the house." That got his attention. He sat up, grabbing his phone and switching on the flashlight. The door was slightly ajar. Josh got up and swung it open. The hallway was empty. "Ryan?" he called. No response. They checked the house. Nothing. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. But when they looked outside, there were footprints in the damp grass. Bare footprints leading from the marsh to their bedroom window. The next morning, they told Ryan and Megan what had happened. "Someone was outside?" Megan asked, looking unnerved. Ryan frowned. "That doesn't make sense. We're miles from town. Who would be sneaking around out here?" Josh and Ryan walked the perimeter of the house, but the footprints stopped abruptly at the marsh's edge. There were no returning prints. It was as if whoever made them had simply vanished into the water. That night, Natalie had trouble sleeping. She kept listening for sounds, expecting the knocking to return. At some point, she finally drifted off, and then the whispering started. It was soft at first, muffled, like voices speaking just outside the window. She turned toward Josh, but he was dead asleep. The whispering grew louder. Then something scraped against the glass. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it was her imagination. Then the bedroom door creaked open. She sucked in a breath, frozen. Josh stirred beside her. "What the hell?" Natalie slowly turned toward the door. It was wide open. A shadow stood in the hallway. Not a person. Something else. It was tall. Impossibly tall. Its limbs too long. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, as if sensing her gaze, it moved. Not walking. Gliding. Straight toward her. Natalie screamed. Josh leaped up, fumbling for his phone. The flashlight beam swept across the room, and the figure was gone. The next morning, Megan was pale. "It was in my room," she whispered, gripping her coffee cup. Ryan nodded. "Same. It was standing in the corner watching us." They decided to leave. Packing was frantic. No one spoke. As they carried their bags out to the car, Natalie glanced toward the marsh, and that's when she saw them. Figures, standing just beyond the tall grass. Dozens of them. Watching. Waiting. She blinked, and they were gone. No one looked back as they drove away. They never spoke about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, Natalie still wakes to knocking at her window, and she knows they found her. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The spring break trip had been Megan's idea. She wanted something different from the usual beach parties and crowded resorts, something quieter, more secluded. When she found the old lake house in the mountains of North Carolina, it seemed perfect. The house sat on the edge of a deep, still lake surrounded by thick woods. No neighbors, no noise, just nature. Megan convinced her boyfriend, Tyler, her best friend, Rachel, and Rachel's boyfriend, Eric, to come along. The rental listing promised rustic charm and total privacy, and the pictures showed a beautiful, if slightly run-down house with a long wooden dock stretching into the water. The drive up took longer than expected. The road twisted through dense forest, the trees pressing in on both sides. By the time they arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake. "This place is creepy," Rachel said, stepping out of the car. "Come on," Megan laughed. "It's just old." Tyler grabbed their bags. "I think it's cool. It's like something out of a horror movie." Rachel shot him a glare. Not helping. The house was bigger than expected, 2 stories with a wraparound porch. The inside smelled of wood and dust. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the windows overlooked the dark lake. A faded family portrait hung over the fireplace. 3 people, their faces blurred by time. "Wonder what happened to them," Eric muttered. Megan found a guest book in the living room. Flipping through, she noticed something odd. There were no recent entries. The last guests had stayed over 10 years ago. "That's weird," she said, showing the others. "Maybe it's just not a popular rental," Rachel offered, though she didn't sound convinced. They shrugged it off. That night, they sat on the dock, drinking beers and watching the moon reflect off the water. The lake was eerily silent. No birds, no crickets. Just the soft lapping of the water against the dock. "I swear I read something about this place," Eric said, taking a sip of his beer. "Something about people going missing here." Rachel elbowed him. "Shut up." "No, really," he insisted. "I think I read it online. Like, hikers disappearing near the lake." Megan rolled her eyes. "You're just trying to freak us out." Eric smirked but said nothing. They went to bed late, the alcohol making them heavy with sleep. At some point during the night, Megan woke up. Something was tapping on the window. At first she thought it was a tree branch, but then she realized there were no trees that close to the house. Knock, knock, knock. She held her breath. It was slow, deliberate. She turned toward Tyler, but he was snoring softly beside her. Then the doorknob rattled. Megan sat up fast, heart hammering. She stared at the door, barely able to breathe. Then, silence. She told herself she was imagining things. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe she dreamed the sound. But when she got up the next morning, Rachel looked pale. "Did you hear it?" Rachel whispered. Megan hesitated. "Hear what?" "The knocking." Megan's stomach twisted. "You heard it too?" Rachel nodded. "At my window. And then I swear I heard someone walking outside my door." Tyler and Eric dismissed it as paranoia. "Old houses make noise," Tyler said. "Creaking wood, animals outside. It's nothing." But Megan wasn't so sure. That day, they took a boat out on the lake, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The water was too still, the air heavy. Rachel shivered. "I don't like this place." Megan tried to laugh it off. "It's just a lake." But something about the water made her uneasy. That night, the knocking came back. Megan woke to it again, soft, slow taps against the window. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The doorknob rattled. She squeezed her eyes shut, life willing it to stop. Then she heard something inside the room, a faint creak of the wooden floor. She felt the bed shift slightly, as if someone was standing right next to it. Her heart pounded. Then nothing. She didn't sleep after that. The next morning, Rachel was visibly shaken. "I saw something last night." Tyler frowned. "What?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Outside my window. A figure. It was just standing there, watching." Eric tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. "Probably just your reflection." Rachel shook her head. "It was outside." Megan and Rachel decided they wanted to leave. Tyler and Eric protested. "We paid for the whole week," Eric argued. "We're not leaving over some weird noises." Megan hesitated. Maybe they were being paranoid. Maybe it was just an old house making old house noises. They agreed to stay one more night. Big mistake. That night, the air felt heavier. The house felt different, like it was waiting. Megan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Then she heard it, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't just at her window. It was at every window. She sat up. "Tyler," she whispered, shaking him. He grumbled, half asleep. Then the front door creaked open. Megan froze. Soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. Then Rachel screamed. Megan and Tyler bolted out of bed. Rachel was standing in the hallway, staring at something. Megan followed her gaze and saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, featureless. It was standing at the end of the hall, its head slightly tilted. Then it moved, fast. Rachel slammed her door. Tyler yanked Megan into their room, locking the door behind them. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Then the knocking started. But this time it wasn't on the windows. It was on their bedroom door. Knock, knock. The air in the room grew cold, Megan clutched Tyler's arm. The knocking grew louder. Then it stopped. Silence stretched. Then something whispered through the door. A voice. Low. Ragged. "Let me in." Megan's blood turned to ice. Tyler grabbed the keys. "We're leaving. Now." They didn't pack. They didn't look back. They ran to the car. The woods too silent around them. They drove all night, not stopping until they were miles away. They never spoke about what they saw. But sometimes, late at night, Megan still hears knocking at her window. Soft. Slow. Waiting. Story the end.